And the thing is, Tim, we have Matt here with us. He's going to be talking to us about Ethiopia. And this is like one of the last independent countries in Africa and it's sort of in East Africa. People know where it is. And what amazes me is that when I was a kid back in the 80s, they had this whole thing about Save Ethiopia. And they used to show
Hmm.
like video footage of like kids with flies on their eyes and stuff, like they were starving. And it was just
No.
the craziest thing. And a lot of people wondered, like, whatever happened to Ethiopia?
Huh.
Then there was all kinds of destabilization in that region, and you got pirates and all kinds of stuff. And I know there's a tremendous stuff to learn about what's going on there. And now it looks like Biden, the pretender in chief, is trying to flex some muscle there. And I have really big questions for Matt because he's been doing a big deep dive on it for Strategic Culture Foundation. So Tim, I can't wait to get started.
Well, yeah, well, I think where we should start off is this really interesting phone conversation that you wrote about regarding Ethiopia, Matt. Could you tell us what was this phone conversation? It's kind of like the core of your article, so it's probably a good place to start.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for having me on, guys. Yeah, that phone conversation that you're referencing was a bit of a hook that I used to sort of spring into a broader image or a narrative of what is going on in Ethiopia right now, because there is a certain shifting of focus from the Southwest Asian region, where a lot of the efforts for regime change and just scorched earth policies were practiced for the past 20 years, and now what we're seeing is a reconfiguration in a major way, where there is, because largely of the multipolar alliance bringing its presence both militarily and through economic cooperation and backdoor diplomacy, we've seen a chance for real reconstruction and stabilization throughout the entire Middle Eastern corridor and beyond. And so a lot of the fanatics who had been pushing the scorched earth policy have really sort of refocused their orientation towards major hotspots in Africa that they want to amplify. Ethiopia is the focus of this current paper. And on November 23rd, there was a Zoom call that took place between an unnamed number of acting and foreign Western diplomats, representatives of the rules-based order, and Berhane Gebrekristos, who is the official spokesperson and head of the Tigray People's Liberation Movement.
Mm-hmm.
And it was the banner of this was hosted by what's called the Peace and Development Center International, which was essentially a one-year-old cutout group funded by USAID, the National Endowment for Democracy, and other typical CIA front groups, which funded this conference call. Now, somebody on the conference call was recording it with their phone, so it was a 2-hour thing where the entire discussion was how to overthrow the current government of Ethiopia, whose prime minister is Abiy Ahmed, or Ahmed Abiy. And essentially, it was designed around this current scandal that was cooked up about a year ago, almost a year ago. There's been a civil war that's been brewing, that's being fed by external forces, utilizing a faction, a small sort of autonomous, quasi-autonomous region in Tigray, where there are rebel groups who have been deployed, armed, and utilized to conduct terror operations against official government forces. And this has killed a lot of people so far. The thing that the West, the rules-based orderistas, as I like to call them, have been trying to put a lot of pressure on the current Ethiopian government to sit down and actually recognize these rebel groups who have used child soldiers. There's documentation of terrorist activities that they've conducted across the board. But they want to treat them. They're saying the Ethiopian government must treat these people as if they were legitimate dialogue partners to reorganize your entire government, decentralize it, and bring it back into the Western sphere of influence. So I sort of paint
Well,
a
I
bit
would
of
say,
a
of
picture
course,
about
they
that.
want to do that because they want to make sure that once you sort of sign an agreement between two parties, that means that both parties have to exist. Because it's sort of that game of acknowledgement. Once you've been acknowledged, you've won something to an extent. So maybe that's it. Well,
Exactly.
here's one question, kind of a little follow up. I've talked to a few people from Africa over the years, especially people in Rwanda. I asked them about, the big tragedy they had in the 90s, how everyone was killing each other based on their tribal affiliations. And to my surprise, they really don't understand what happened.
Mm.
They don't really have, like I asked them, so what was the core? How do you tell the difference between each other? What was this all about? Nothing. They just know that somehow everyone got flustered up and there were problems. Going over, I've met people who've lived in Uganda. And in Uganda, they've had similar sort of situations with sort of these odd groups proclaiming to be some sort of revolutionaries. Who knows who they are? But whether if the media in the West wants to legitimize them, they'll legitimize them. So not just these two examples from my own personal life, but we've heard stories across Africa. So what is the source of this ease at which some sort of odd group can come up in Africa and claim to be the legitimate ruler of some region?
I mean, there are things that are in the shadows, but overall, yeah, there's a common sort of species characteristic across the board, whether we see the rebel groups who we increasingly discover in Syria to be tied to Al-Qaeda outfits, being provided all sorts of logistical, monetary, and other support by Western affiliates using proxies throughout the Middle East at different times. Turkey, Saudi Arabia, we know played a role in that. The same modus operandi has been at play for a very long time in Africa as well. And, you know, sometimes you have to sort of indirectly get at the controlling hand behind the scenes. When you see, for example, the Tigray People's Liberation Front, they recently created or announced a new umbrella group to unite all of the different rebel factions, because there's a very multi-ethnic area around Somalia, I mean, South Sudan, all of that area around Ethiopia. There's a lot of different groups that all have their own interests, and they're trying to create sort of a legitimate unified front. And the place where this front was announced it was going to be created was in Washington, D.C. Now, overall, yeah, the fact that nation states, you could destroy them in a variety of ways. There's economic warfare. There's the outright conventional military, bomb them to a stone age. Both of those things have been deployed quite a bit. But then there's the asymmetrical warfare, which I know you guys have talked a lot about and written a lot about. And I think every one of the viewers here probably knows something about this, where you can utilize color revolutionary activities. So things masquerading as democratic freedom movements, just like, the Mujahideen was created originally as a radical branch of jihadists in Afghanistan in the 1980s by Zbigniew Brzezinski. This is what Al-Qaeda grew out of. And you sell it to the Western credulous population as being rebel fighters fighting against authoritarianism for freedom. But in reality, these are the worst of the worst elements of human society who are being, given unlimited amounts of support to destabilize the government from within in order to cripple it and then reabsorb it back into the rules-based order or whatever type of system of empire you want. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, that's the thing. And I was told as well, I was supporting a kid for $1 a day as well, watching World Vision programs when I was a kid, and always wondering, like, why is it that these places are so, with all of the wealth we have and technology in the world, why is it that there are these kids with flies in their eyes and such poverty and chaos and warfare? Why is there no solution? And adults, whether teachers or my family members, never had an answer. And it's only when you realize, later on when you become more politically savvy, just how much artificial intervention is.
One of the hardest questions is answering any question about motivations. Motivations are really tough to prove. But I'm going to throw a question at you anyways, because I get sick of answering questions about people's motivations. So these rebels, right, are they the kind of useful, like the leadership, not the grunts, the actual sort of organizing leadership layer? Are they sort of useful idiots, or do they sort of see this as, yeah, the West is going to get this, this, and this, but we're going to get the money. I'm going to take the sort of official throne. I'm going to get a ton of money out of this. Are they just, or do they have some sort of principles they actually believe in, and they're just looking for any financier? What is their inner motivation? What are they doing?
Well, if you're asking about people like Berhane Gebrekristos, who's the head of the Tigray's People Liberation Movement and their official sort of army outfit, I don't think he's in any way an honest player. He's the former foreign minister of Ethiopia for about 2 years, back in 2008 to 10. And no, I think he himself doesn't really care very much about Ethiopia as a whole, its welfare or anything. I think he's primarily in it for himself, and probably certain promises to have a lot of political power as the de facto or the new head replacing the ousted Prime Minister Abiy. There are people perhaps who are naive idealists, as we've seen across the board, who really get swept into this sort of thing. And I don't want to put everybody in the same box. And we've seen, you can usually get a sense of who those are when the time comes for a real chance for peace and diplomacy to occur, who's willing to come to a diplomatic table and have a discussion with the targeted government, and who's willing to just completely double down and keep on a violent pathway and not negotiate. Because if you really care about your people, you care about peace as a priority. So there are people like that who I think would be more than willing within the Tigray area to sit down and actually have a serious dialogue around election reform, around benefiting by a lot of the infrastructure that's being built right now by Ethiopia. Ethiopia is the only uncolonized country in Africa that's never been subdued by a colonial power of Europe ever. They always resisted. And so they have a lot of tradition, a lot of this power that's given them an ability to invest in big infrastructure projects like no other African country has. Obviously, China has helped too on a variety of these things. And so the Tigray people, they want, I mean, for the most part, they want to be able to benefit by this. They want to be able to participate in a better future. And I think, yeah, if you could get rid of the CIA operatives at the top of their controlling matrix, I think a lot of the people would immediately jump on board with a serious conversation that benefits all parties. And China would help, Russia would help, other countries would help, as managing that dialogue in a better way.
Now, you just mentioned the projects, because in your article, another sort of a core pillar of what you're talking about has to do with the construction of various dams, working in conjunction with the Chinese. Even I'm looking at a map here on my screen of the train railway from Djibouti, which I've never been able to say properly, to Addis Ababa. What is this railway river dam project all about? Obviously, the Nile River extends down very long, and you're getting into the tributaries of the Nile. So in a very dusty climate, I understand that people need to drink, but there's probably something more than just that.
Oh yeah, you got it. No, there's, I mean, the empire of chaos, as some people have called it, rules by scarcity. Get people to live and adapt to a world of scarcity that's managed and monopolized by certain forces, and then as people live in a state of want, they can be more induced to fight their neighbors for diminishing returns of water or whatever. That's certainly been what's applied to this area. Now, the Nile area has been developed since 2011. There's a great need for electricity. I mean, the amount of poverty in Africa is astounding. I mean, something like 30,000 children die of unnecessary causes, water sanitation, lack of water, lack of food, totally preventable disease every day in primarily Africa. So if you could get abundant electricity, then you could start developing the means of production, the means of sustaining the population, building the type of infrastructure a modern society requires if it's going to avoid the type of deaths, disease, other things. So the Nile passes through Egypt, Sudan, as you see there in the map. Mm-hmm. South Sudan, there's branches for the Blue Nile and the White Nile, but also you have into Ethiopia. Ethiopia is landlocked. So there's two big projects. How do you bring Ethiopia into a broader communion with the rest of the world? And this is where primarily the Chinese government funded Addis Ababa to Djibouti railway is very important, which has been built as of 2017 as a 750 kilometer standard gauge rail. It could extend easily in a variety of directions throughout Sudan and its neighboring countries into Kenya, which also has a lot of Chinese investments building rail all over Kenya. Also, now that Yemen, this is very important, right? There's a little area past the Red Sea there that's an easy connecting point with rail into Yemen. And since the Houthis have done a very good job resisting the onslaughts by the Saudis over the past 5-6 years, there's actually now hope in that we're seeing for a peaceful resolution, even though the Saudis aren't giving up very easily. If you can really stabilize that zone, it won't be very, very difficult to continue rail throughout Yemen as a driver for a broader industrial program. China really is a friendly nation to a lot of these things. So In March of this year, China and Ethiopia signed a protective agreement, a partnership to protect BRI-oriented projects in Ethiopia. That's the Ethiopian and Chinese military are going to be combining and have been combining their defenses around protecting infrastructure. This is what China desperately needs. And one of the reasons that a lot of the big infrastructure hasn't gone as fast as it should have throughout Africa. Keep in mind, over 44 countries of sub-Saharan Africa have joined the Chinese BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative. That's a huge number that have signed on to the framework. And there's all sorts of projects that look piecemeal, but they're all part of a greater design that can easily harmonize, synergize into a broader continental African program for a real industrial driver program from Nigeria all the way to the West Coast. So then you have the Grand Renaissance Dam. This is the biggest dam. Like I said, it was started in 2011. It couldn't get the biggest dam that Africa has ever seen. It's nearly completed right now on the Blue Nile. It would create something about I think it's 6.2 gigawatts of power that it would generate when all of the reservoirs are filled, and it's now really starting. The turbines are fully on pace. The thing is, the way it was funded. Not only is this project verboten by certain quarters who want to keep Africa underdeveloped to better exploit them, but the way it was funded involved Ethiopia being rejected by the IMF and the World Bank because money is only allowed to go towards African aid under certain conditionalities that they do not use any of that money that we've been giving them for decades on real development that benefits their people or nation states. That's not permitted. So they couldn't get the funding for that. And so instead, what they did is they said, well, let's do it ourselves. And they began issuing bonds that the population primarily invested in, up to $5 billion worth, that were tied to the project. So it gave every citizen in Ethiopia a personal incentive to benefit the nation as a whole, which has worked miracles. This is ironically what the United States used to do. That's how Abraham Lincoln, as I point out in my article, funded the Transcontinental Railway, was through these 5 to 10 year or 5 to 20 year maturation bonds, which the bond itself is tied to a project which is beneficial to the nation as a whole.
Yeah.
At different times, Roosevelt did that too, both before World War II and during World War II later on with victory bonds.
So to be clear, so you're talking about the type of bond where it's something like you pay $20 now, and in 5 years the government gives you $40. Is it something like that?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, you get a reasonable maturation, reasonable interest, but it's tied to a project. It's not just whatever, and it's the project itself, because there are certain types of projects that will increase their what are called inflationary debt creation projects. So like look at the Green New Deal or the Biden infrastructure program currently. Those are bad debt. You're going to create a debt to build infrastructure, which is not intrinsically bad. It could be good, but the type of infrastructure under the Green New Deal is going to, once built, once you spread windmills and solar panels across the United States, it's going to reduce your ability to produce because the quality of the energy is so shit from those sources that you cannot sustain heavy industry anymore. You can't sustain the type of growth expectancies you were able to do in the 1970s. Even you're going back, regressing. So you're taking out debt, which is going to be infinitely worse in the future, regardless of the momentary speculative paybacks.
And that's why branding is important, because they were like, what could we call this? Oh yeah, Green New Deal. Well, for everyone in the Democrat Party, they all agree the New Deal worked, so we'll just slap green on it and everyone will vote for it. Everything is about the branding. Joaquin, I see you looking sort of skeptically at us. It looks like you've got something to say, something to interject here.
Well, no, it's just when I look at what the United States 20 years ago, when I was in university, I had a professor and we were doing a lot on the region, and it was disclosed then that the U.S. had no development plans or goals for Africa at all whatsoever. So that's fine. I mean, the U.S. doesn't owe anybody to have development plans, but why then would they want to stop other countries from investing in certain regions of Africa? I mean, it's one thing to say we have no interest, but then why would your interest be in subverting developmental plans that might come from all, other places? In this case, we're talking about China. And I think that becomes a difficult issue sometimes for Americans, especially, to understand, because many Americans do not want to lose their jobs to Chinese manufacturing because the arrangement has been so bad. So they don't understand necessarily that other countries have been inviting Chinese interests in because other countries have actually created obstacles to development. And that's so it's really not the same thing.
No.
And my question for Matt then is, when you look at what the deep state in the US is doing to stoke tensions in Ethiopia, are these along ethnic or tribal or these types of historic ethnic lines? I know that when the British Empire and some of the French powers in colonial Africa, they made these countries intentionally to lump different antagonistic groups together in a single country, as we call it, in order to make them manageable, if you will, in order so they could play divide and conquer. Do we see any of that in the region, in particular in Ethiopia?
I'm not going to comment so much on that direct answer, but what I do know is you're totally right. And we brought up the Rwandan massacre as one example. The Hutus and the Tutsis. I mean, these are people who have everything in common, but there's these different tribal differences. And the Tutsis were always a minority group. I think it was like 10% of the whole. And during the time of empire, they were consciously, the minority group was brought into an elitist position, a managerial position as a higher caste above the majority Hutus by their colonial powers. Who just utilized them, right? As just the same way the British Raj deployed that same model in India, reinforcing a higher caste, reinforcing an elitist outlook, and then obviously over decades of injustice that would necessarily come with being, a house, for the master. Then you built up a lot of animosity. So when the first opportunity arose, for revenge, there was a lot of revengeist sentiment, and that resulted in a blowback for the Tutsis. I should laugh
it gets a little bit
confusing.
Like I
Rwanda,
said,
right?
even in their country, they don't even know the difference anymore. So it can be a little confusing.
Yeah. And this is like utilizing the old counter gang operations that were developed by Frank Kitson on behalf of the British in Kenya during the Mau Mau uprisings in 1954-55. These were like really worked through techniques of, if you have a revolutionary anti-imperial movement, Frank Kitson was on the ground in Kenya working at how do you deploy certain techniques to create fake counter-revolutionary groups and then counter to those revolutionary groups. And he writes all about this in order to basically diffuse and destroy any type of legit revolutionary sentiment that could work. And that's sort of something we've seen deployed across the board, and it's very manipulative and racist. But as far as like the Ethiopian examples and case studies, I won't comment directly on that because I just haven't done the work to speak as an authority on those models deployed for Ethiopia. The one thing though, on the issue, because we were talking about the Grand Renaissance Dam, there's the point that I wanted to just hit at, is that this is what is really being targeted in a variety of ways. Because if you build, unlike the Green New Deal, the real type of New Deal projects, which this Grand Renaissance Dam is, and in a literal way, this program, there's another picture if you scroll, I think, up a little bit, or is it down? Yeah, or there it is, right. That's the big one right there, that big yellow one. That they're trying to get Sudan, especially South Sudan and Egypt, to see this dam as a threat. So there's a lot of effort to get these governments to perceive the Ethiopian Grand Renaissance Dam as something that will destroy their availability to Nile water. This is not true because the dam itself will not be used for agriculture or even drinking in this case. That's not why the dam is being used. It's specifically and only for electricity generation. So that water is going to continue, just feed right back into the Nile source and continue to go upriver into Egypt and Sudan. But
could you tell us where, sorry, Sue, but yeah, could you tell us where, if you know, on this map, the rebel group has their base of support?
In the north, on the border of Eritrea. And
are there now would they have support or unofficially from Eritrean security agencies, or are they going back and forth across the border, or do we know at this point?
There is very porous borders, and there are groups from Sudan, from Eritrea, who are all sort of being locked together under this umbrella group of the United Front of Ethiopians and Federalist and Confederate Forces that was set up in Washington. They're not really. I don't think, from what I've read so far, that they're most of these groups who are part of the list, and there's like 20 of these groups. Most of them are not really playing a very big role in much. They have certain representatives who sign their group's name onto the list to give it legitimacy on behalf of certain, whatever it was, bribes or threats by Western interests. The primary group, though, is the Tigray People's Defense Forces. That is driving a lot of, like, 99% of the heavy lifting is coming from these groups. Which again involves people from a variety of ethnic backgrounds. It's not just Tigray, as you said, and it's messy. So, like I said, it's one of these chaos things that's going to take some time to just sort of shed light on the different chaos of it all.
And are Biden's deep state puppet masters, are they looking at directly intervening or increasing support for this? So what are the forms that would take?
Well, so far, we primarily have the Biden deep state active official voices are calling for sitting down, putting pressure on the Ethiopian government with the threat of sanctions, the removal of various economic incentives that are really hurting a lot of Ethiopians massively right now, who benefited by certain financial deals with the U.S. That's all been removed, to put pressure on them, to get them to sit down and actually treat the defense forces of Tigray as if they were legit. But then you have people like, what's his name? James Stavidris, the former Supreme Commander of Allied Supreme Commander of NATO, who's still a big, Atlantic Council NATO mouthpiece, who's been writing vociferously for a U.S. military intervention into Ethiopia to stop, a new Rwandan genocide type of experience, always portraying the Ethiopian government as if they were the new supervillains of the world. A lot of this is being justified by the old, Tony Blair, Soros, R2P responsibility to protect logic. That's not yet the official voice, but we know that that's the orientation that this thing is going. And when you listen to Berhane Gebrekristos, he's also spoken openly about the need for even possibly a military coup, which he thinks somehow can happen. Now, the thing is, a lot of this is perception. They don't really have a lot of the support, and the Ethiopian people, by and large, are completely not falling for this at all. Either the diaspora internationally, or obviously the people in Ethiopia. There's a very strong sense of the false perception management game being played. So the story being conveyed to Western idiots watching their media, watching CNN or whatever. They're being told that Berhane Gebrekristos and this group is kind of like Juan Guaido or Navalny or the Hong Kong freedom fighters, it's only inevitable. It's only a matter of time before they overthrow the big bad government with the help of the US, ideally. Yeah. But the reality is totally different, right? These are goose eggs. In all cases, Hong Kong or Russia or Venezuela, that the reality is they have no chance of getting what they want.
And one thing is, when you look at Ethiopia being between Somalia and Sudan, two regions that are both known for being sort of not in a literal sense, but very anarchic, as in, maybe there's a government somewhere, but they're not going to stop much. So is Ethiopia really a country that would have a solid, powerful government that can really organize things? Or even if they did come in and there was a revolution, would just nothing change, like in Afghanistan, for example?
Well, in Ethiopia, like I said, it's just so different because they've been able to maintain independence. And, going back to Haile Selassie, one of the greatest Pan-African leaders, this Grand Renaissance Dam, and I'll circuit back to your question. This Grand Renaissance Dam was actually built under his, or the plans for it were constructed under his
kidding.
watch.
Oh,
yeah.
wow.
And actually with the help of JFK's USA, which was a very different creature than the current USA we know of today. They were actually sending teams of engineers on the ground to help survey and build up plans for the dam. And that was when it was started in the early 60s. Unfortunately, Selassie was ousted in 74. The thing was dustbined, and it was only revived, decades later. So the thing about the current, repeat your question. Sorry, I sidetracked myself.
I actually want to jump off to something more important, because I think one thing we've kind of missed on all this is we sort of glazed over one fact. So we've been talking about how the IMF has been very manipulative in Africa. Basically, we give you money with a terrible rate of return. The percent on the money, what you have to return. What is it? The interest.
Rate, yeah.
Terrible interest rate, right? We've talked about how America has also tried to influence projects and revolutions like that for their own selfish gains. But what about the Chinese? This Belt and Road Initiative, and also a lot of media initiatives across Africa coming from China. Are you trying to say that this is the Chinese are very, very just altruistic because they're communist, or is China doing exactly the same thing that the Western powers have done in Africa, maybe just a little bit more friendly?
No, I would say neither one of those two options. They need desperately resources, so that's not like altruism in that way, in that naive way of thinking we just want to like do sprinkle good around the world just because we believe in inequality for everybody. No, it's not that. They desperately need resources. Africa has a lot of resources and not a lot of infrastructure, not a lot of ways of actually utilizing them, whether for China or for Africans. So there's a certain type of operating system philosophy that's come out of China around the idea of win-win cooperation, which, like I said, going back to JFK and the teams of engineers that were deployed to Africa to help plan the building of big dam projects, that was a philosophy that we had once had access to here in the West, which we've lost a long time ago. Even the whole idea of an international New Deal, like a real New Deal, was spread by people like Kwame Nkrumah, who had studied in the United States, had befriended allies of Roosevelt, had studied the Tennessee Valley Authority, and wanted to bring that back as a driver for an African Renaissance, a real industrial Renaissance in the 1950s, which is what led, the entire, independence movements to begin with. Haile Selassie was a part of that. So was Jomo Kenyatta. So is Patrice Lumumba from Congo. Many of these were assassinated or ousted by CIA-run coups, as we know. But the idea was it was based on an idea of rational, competent business where you don't have to gain wealth by just screwing over and stealing it from somewhere else. You could do things in a way that involved long-term thinking, a tight, like 5 to 30-year orientation, right? Very long-term, not just short-term myopic speculation to make money in the now, as has really corrupted the Western psyche over the past decades. But it was really build real things that have measurable growth, that have measurable value and abundance that you can create, that not only extinguish the debt you incur in the moment, because you have to create a debt to start investing to build something, but that type of project not only extinguishes it, but it creates so much abundance, a qualitative upshift that every participant benefits, large and small alike, rich and poor. Everybody can benefit by that type of thinking, which China has exhibited really successfully and consistently. So I'm not saying that there aren't problems and injustices here and there, but overall, what we've seen coming out of China's approach to the Belt and Road internationally and its financing mechanisms are very different from the IMF and World Bank, where they have actually assigned investment in the trillion. This is like a $3 trillion project so far, and it's going to grow, for nations to develop engineers, like educational corridors to build and train engineers in Ethiopia that the West never did. The West would, if they would build infrastructure, the technique for under the IMF, World Bank, and before that British Empire dominated model was you build a tiny little road from the mine to the port that will allow you to extract the resources using only your Western approved of engineers, benefiting the people zero, maybe sending some money to create a culture of graft in whatever country, so that when you have a culture of corruption, better able to, it's better, more easy to
you can
manage.
open whatever mine you want, wherever you want, whenever you want.
Exactly. And nothing benefits the people. The poverty only increases no matter how much investment is put into these zones. And so China's doing it very differently, and they're building hospitals, sanitation corridors, the most incredible things. And they're doing it with an outlook towards broader continental interconnectivity, which is where they're actually winning the real trust of the Africans and others who have been like just burnt and abused for generations by great powers. They're seeing something very different happen. So China will be getting stuff. They will be getting resources. They're also going to be getting trading partners that are developed. And when you have industrial developed trading partners in Africa, instead of just poor people who are like living in squalor, that will be more of a consumption base. They're going to consume more. So that's more output for China to sell to. Also higher quality goods, finished products will be produced there, where that can then be sold to China. So it's overall just, again, better business, and it's more competent in terms of natural law, as I think of natural law as the law that's built, that we have to adapt to if we're going to have the moral fitness to survive in the universe. There's certain types of economic behavior that involves obedience to justice in that higher sense of the word, that if you deny it, yeah, you could become an empire for a while, but that thing is going to be destined to collapse under its own folly. It's not sustainable. No empire lives, definitely.
What do the rebels think? What's their angle? We understand how they're manipulated, and they're against the building of this project. But what are they? Is there an alternate plan?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty much one of these like vacant freedom and democracy, decentralize, liberalize our economy, because the current government of Ahmed Abiy has centralized a lot. They've put him and his new party that he created involves creating a more top-down structure, which makes it easy for Western idiots who love a naive idea of freedom to call it authoritarian. But really, it's important if you have to do battle with an internationally extended deep state, which is highly centralized, you have to yourself have a sovereign nation state that's capable of coordinating activity as an instrument, a weapon in defense of the people and the interests of the nation as a whole. If you have a highly decentralized nation, the way, the West is saying, anybody who's going to be considered one of the good guys invited to our democracy summits, you have to have a certain type of, no protective tariffs, right? And they abuse the term democracy in a way that involves just castrating the power of the nation state to do anything, to coordinate any type of big project. So these people have been sold on an idea of democracy, which is false. They think it's going to give them more power and autonomy to chart out their own destiny. It's a false promise. It's not going to happen. They will be carved up. And we saw similar things. You brought up the example earlier, Tim, of Sudan and the neighbors.
Yeah. Look
at Sudan, right? I mean, in the 1980s, they were 89% finished. One of the biggest canals connecting the White and Blue Nile, called the Jonglei Canal. Mm-hmm. A German firm was building this thing, and it was cutting deep into the soil. Like I said, it was nearly completed, which would have been an industrial driver to end poverty throughout that zone, until a convenient grouping of pro-democracy loving rebels who were anti-authoritarian were reduced to like start a civil war. The thing has been like rotting, collecting just as a rust thing, being used for target practice by rebels for the next 3 decades. It's still sitting there.
Well, no one's going to come and fill it in. So
no one's going to No, exactly. And the fact that when President Bashir, up until 2008, 2009, who had been working with Gaddafi, had been working with Mubarak at building a different sort of North African economic zone around Gaddafi's great man-made river project, which was completely transformative, again, with the help of certain Western private corporations that were helping to build this giant project to green big areas of the Sahara and desalinate water from the Mediterranean and bring up water from under the Sahara. That was transformative, and it was being funded by an outside of the IMF sphere of influence, by the local exchanges and currencies of Sudan, Egypt, and primarily Gaddafi at the time was driving that. So President Bashir of Sudan, was immediately targeted by the entire George Soros International Criminal Court crap, saying that he's an authoritarian, he should be tried for genocide. Rebel groups of the Christian-dominated South were empowered by people like Susan Rice, who's back in power again under Team Obama's back under Biden, right? Mm-hmm. And she encouraged the carving up of South Sudan, making it its own separate country to better create conflict between the North and the South. And the Jonglei Canal fell in the South, where it was more guaranteed that it would never be revived, although Bashir wanted to move in that direction. Mm-hmm. Same thing for Mubarak. The whole Arab Spring was launched, ousting him in the wake of Gaddafi's murder. And you had the Muslim Brotherhood, which got right in there. We know the connection to Obama's half brother, who was a big controller of this thing. And it was only when the current government of El-Sisi got in that you started getting a bit of stabilization, but there's still a lot of Western tentacles inside of these zones that are keeping them from creating the type of block of progress that could easily happen, which is why, along with, 2011, that was when Bashar al-Assad in Syria was also advancing his 5C strategy of connecting all of the great 5C water systems around development.
A question that might be a little bit too big and a little bit too global, but I kind of want to hear your thoughts on it, because it's not just yourself, but many people. I've heard my entire adult life about how the West has really pushed down on Africa and keeps it down. And in Russia, there are a lot of both reasonable and unreasonable theories as to why Russia is extremely rich, and yet the population is not so rich. And it usually goes to, again, the West, CIA, deep state, and all this. Why does the rest of the world continue to fail to resist these kind of plans that happen over and over and over again? What are people missing? Be it Africa, be it Russia, be it Syria, and so on.
So why is it that the West continues to
why does it always work? They succeed. They have a very high success rate.
Oh.
It's sort of like, what is that? Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. That kind of logic.
Yeah, but Bush said it better. He said, fool me once, shame on you. You could fool me twice. You can't get fooled again.
Yeah, fool me, can't get fooled again. Yeah.
Let's limit the scope. Why does this keep happening then in the sort of Ethiopia, Sudan, that sort of northeastern desert Africa region? Why? Why do they? Are they unable to resist?
That's a big question. I think that from the way I look at it, history is really something which is in the process of still happening, right? And it's like we're living in history, and future historians are going to look back at our time and evaluate the folly or the wisdom that were made by people who chose to be or not be courageous when they needed to be, which is I think the heart of true tragedy is the absence when somebody has the ability and the responsibility to risk their lives for the sake of something bigger than themselves, and they choose not to. They give in to their fear, whatever vice, whatever, and they choose to let the process, with or without their participation, go into a destructive course that it didn't have to go into if they were just bigger people. History is something that's unfolding as we speak, and so far we haven't broken from our tragic impulse. So there have been untragic, great men and women who have risen to the stage in history at different times. And I mentioned a few of them, John F. Kennedy. We've had our Haile Selassie's, and we've had our Kwame Nkrumah's, and we've had our Patrice Lumumba's, and many, many, many others. But the problem when they die, and they were willing to die, that's what made them so powerful, is that they recognized the higher value in their purpose and in their soul as being more important than the health of their body. But when they died, those who had been inspired by them chose to live in fear or not pick up the torch and not take the stage of history. And so it peters out. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you get, the followers of somebody. I'm thinking of, for example, Christ, like his followers had their moments of weakness. They luckily got their shit together at a certain time and founded the early church and continued the fight. So sometimes you get examples like that. You get that in a variety of religions. Muhammad's followers as well had a lot of fear. There was a lot of persecution, a lot of death, but they chose to be bigger people and can carry it on. The thing today is we are living in a world that, especially here in the transatlantic West, is ripe with folly. People have adapted to an imperial educational system, an imperial system of structures that has you just focus on your personal reality and not think about the deeper reality. Like, I got a high quality of life compared to much of the world. But, we're talking about watching as children, right, these pictures of World Vision and kids suffering in Africa. And you're like, well, what type of injustice has to occur of cheap labor, exploitation for my life standard to be maintained in the abundance that I enjoy it? And it's very easy to answer that question, but it's very hard to address it properly, because that means your whole life is based on slavery in a very vicious, evil way today, which would require you, if you were obedient to your conscience, to change how you relate to the system that you were born into. And demand change. To an extent,
our friends with the colorful hair, the SJWs, they do try to sort of raise that question in society, but it's always done very badly and very naively and generally with wrong information. But there is somewhat of a teeny tiny attempt to do that.
Well, that's the tragedy between the whole like left-right polarized dichotomization of society, is that the left tend to be very heart-based, feeling-based people, but mentally, like cognitively atrophied to a huge degree. So there's the idea that truth is how I feel. I feel like I am cisgender or whatever. Like make whatever I feel becomes true. There is no objective.
I feel that, now that straws are banned in California, we've achieved something massive for the future of landfills in the world. It's that kind of thinking. It's like, no.
It's so soft. And then you have the hypertrophied sort of right-wing thinking, which overly imposes logic in a cold way that cuts the heart from its proper role as a guide to the mind. And then you got these, let's just universal health care is, that's for socialists. Like, let the poor, if you can't afford it, you don't deserve it, or whatever, privatize everything. Then the strong will survive and the weak will just go their way in a social Darwinian utopia.
We'll have to have you back on the program to talk about how, in a lot of ways, that sort of thinking, I recently heard a very interesting set of theories about how, in a lot of ways, that those sort of different schools of thought reflect actually our sexuality, which is very interesting. Kind of why the sort of alpha Chad guy is usually a hardcore Republican, and the kind of more beta male guy is definitely on the left. So it's kind of interesting how it lines up. I'm not quite sure if that's true, but we'll talk about that in the future. Sure. But I'd just like to sort of wind down today with one final major question here. About you saying that in your article, you say that there's a danger that this situation could turn into Libya 2.0. Well, on the surface, Libya was different. Libya had a very strong, that central figure, that sort of Haile Selassie super cult of personality kind of figure who got killed, and the can of worms opened, and here comes ISIS and ISIS-like individuals. Why would that scenario play out in Ethiopia? Or are you referring to something else? It would have its own
character, but I've sort of been alluding to it, I guess. But the fact that this sort of we see that the formula is in place to try to justify a certain narrative to the West, so that we give our consent to certain things that are outside of reality, but that would justify the sort of military intervention that Jim Stavidris has called for to get U.S. boots on the ground, or just, this could manifest or mutate very easily into an idea that the Ethiopian government, which again is becoming very, very strong and centralized under Abiy, and highly integrated with the Chinese program of development in Africa. They're being painted as if they were the nefarious supervillains of everything, causing the majority of the genocide, and everything that the Tigray Liberation Army is doing is justified in that sense, because it's all defensive, we are told. Not true. None of it is defensive, nor has it been. So, I mean, there are so many similarities in terms of the big projects that are transformative, which if completed, as was the Great Man-Made River System, if that were to go through, there would be an unacceptable amount of independence and progress that would be unleashed by these countries, who would then have the type of power to stand on their own 2 feet and say no, where they currently cannot say no as long as they are kept underdeveloped. And there's also the example where if they are permitted, if those things do go through, other countries, and we know Nigeria, we know Kenya, a lot of the countries of Africa, they want desperately to break free. And if they are given that type of support from an exemplar in their own continent, that would spread like wildfire very, very easily.
The big freedom
Matt,
domino could fall.
I want to thank you, Matt, for coming on with us today. And if you could lead us out with telling us in brief, in a minute or two, what's your prognosis moving forward? What is the situation? We just saw headlines right now. These Tigray rebels captured some blah, blah, blah. That's always questionable, by the way. Whenever you read reportage on conflicts, they misrepresent things all the time. I just thought it was an interesting headline. Could you tell us what the situation looks like moving forward, maybe in 6 months or a year?
Well, it's underdetermined, so it's difficult to say, but I know that there has been a systemic lying. So going back to the news reports for a full year of fighting, it's always the case that the current Ethiopian tyrannical government is about to fall. The Tigray People's Liberation Army is always just surrounded Addis Ababa. They've just cut off this strategic route, and we're being sold these creative writing packages from Reuters that always make it seem as though the good guys are gonna win the day, and it's never true. So I would say, read all of that with a big fat grain of salt. I do think that from what we've seen coming out of Southwest Asia regarding the massive sea change, that we've never seen such transformation, where Syria is being reintegrated into the Arab League. We have Turkey and Iran having high-level diplomatic meetings for Entente. You got Iraq and Iran building rail together. Saudi Arabia is opening up diplomatic channels with both Syria as well as Iran. I mean, their heads of their intelligence and foreign policy apparatuses are meeting together. You got Iran extending a sphere of influence throughout Azerbaijan and Turkmenistan, and tying rail that they've just agreed to 2 days ago into Georgia to be part of the international North-South Transportation Corridor. So many things that are synergistic with the Belt and Road Initiative coming through the Middle East are happening. The connection of pipelines as well through the Caspian is happening fast. There's hope now for the Yemeni crisis to be resolved. So there's a total sea change, and that has given me a high degree of hope. And I know it is largely because of Russia militarily and with their intelligence apparatus going in and providing a certain protective sphere of diplomatic back channel discussions and direct putting their bodies in front of the firing squad. And also China's ability to just invest massively in constructing real things that have real value. This is transformative. So this, as a combined power with Iran as part of that bloc, is creating all sorts of nonlinear changes that would have been impossible 5, 10, or 20 years ago. It would have not happened, couldn't have happened. And that's unfortunate that Gaddafi had to suffer what he suffered, because this didn't exist, this type of, convergence of great civilizations under a common framework to do proper battle with this international rules-based order, deep state, sociopathic thingamajig. I've got great hope that Africa actually has a new set of relationships and potentials now. And going forward, I mean, here in the West, we're sort of locked in a bit of a cuckoo type of logic. And it's not looking great. If you just looked as a Westerner at Western media, you wouldn't have a lot of cause for hope, honestly. So you really have to look with your mind's eye first at the world chemistry first, after which you can situate whatever the hell is going on in your local country, and then have that idea that the only chance we have to avoid here in the West, a total breakdown. I mean, this is going to get messy and bad. Like, we've had it really good up until now, but it's going to get really bad. And the only way that we can avoid a lot of pain is if we harmonize ourselves the way Trump was actually moving in that direction. People might not like that I just said that, but he was.
Yeah.
into a harmonized process of cooperation on economic development with the Belt and Road Initiative, with Russia, with other countries as allies and collaborators, despite our differences. We have to do that. And if we don't, this thing's going to get really ugly.
All right. Well, that was a very powerful last word. There are a lot of points I want to jump in on, mostly because I agree and because I'm passionate about the same things. So, Matt, we're going to have to have you come back on the program, maybe in a couple weeks, because that was very hopeful. Anyways, Joaquin, Matt, Tim, we'll see you in 1 week's time.